My name is Thomas Clark, and welcome to the Takeoff Podcast, where I help equip you to bring the peace of God to the places you live, work, learn, and play, all for His glory. Every problem is a discipleship problem. Being a disciple of Christ does not mean we will not face problems, but it does mean we have the tools to face them faithfully. My worldview is that Christ transforms culture, and He does it through His followers. The goal of Takeoff is to equip you for movemental thinking as we make disciples who make disciples. This is Season 7, and this season is about discipleship that reproduces. Okay, let's get into it. In the last episode, we talked about the mindset shifts needed for reproducible disciple making, or the paradigm shifts that are needed for reproducible disciple making. And now in this episode, we take the next step. You see, because once disciple making becomes reproducible, something else begins to happen. Leaders begin to emerge. Hope you got that. Yeah, once discipleship or disciple making becomes reproducible, disciple making, something else happens, and that is leaders start to emerge. And when leaders emerge, you all, then hyper-local, contextually relevant expressions of the church can form. Let me repeat that. As leaders emerge, hyper-local, contextually relevant expressions of the church, capital C, Church of Jesus Christ, can form. And when churches form, you all, I'm talking about these hyper-local, contextually relevant expressions of the church, and so it's a plural, churches, in various contexts. When they form and reproduce in these organic and contextually relevant ways, movements actually can happen. But the order of how it happened matters. That's important. You see, because if we try to shortcut the process, we may end up building leadership without discipleship. We may wind up having structure without formation, and it's possible to have church activity without any movement. And that's why this episode we're talking about now matters. From disciples to leaders to movement, that matters. Because we need to see clearly that movements do not begin with chasing a title. That's not how movement begins. Movements don't begin because we're chasing church models, looking at how over time, I'm talking about the lowercase c church, how different churches, well, if we call them, have done it. No, that's not how movements begin. Movements, you all, don't begin because we are chasing expansion strategy. You can strategize all you want to, have all kind of strategy you want. But that doesn't help movement start. Movement begin with disciples. Let me be very clear. Movements do not begin with scale. They begin with disciples who reproduce. Yeah, that's how you want a movement. That's how you get movement. Neil Cole said it like this: if you cannot reproduce disciples, you cannot reproduce leaders. And if you cannot reproduce leaders, you won't be able to reproduce churches. And if you won't reproduce or can't reproduce churches, then you will not be able to reproduce movements. And you know what? That's not just a clever line. And there's a good line that Cole gave, but it's not just a clever line. It's a theological and movemental sequence. That there's an order. There's an order to that. Because unfortunately, too many want leaders first, or structure first, or church first, or visible growth first. But you know what Jesus did? The one who said this is His church? He started with disciples. Yeah, He started with disciples. He didn't start with leaders or structure or church or visible growth. He started with disciples. And if disciples are not being formed, then leaders may emerge, but they won't have any depth. If disciples aren't being formed, then churches may gather without mission. If disciples aren't being formed, movements may be talked about without actually taking any root. So this episode is about order, but I'm not talking about order for the sake of control. I'm talking about order for the sake of fruitfulness. Yes, that it matters, because what begins by bypassing discipleship usually struggles to sustain any depth. I'm telling you right now, if you only want multiplication or even just want movement, but you don't have disciples, there'll be no depth. So I think it's important then to realize or understand that disciples are the seedbed of leadership. What does that mean? Well, it means that leaders are best developed when we focus primarily on making disciples. And I know someone's asking, well, why? Why is that? And it's a good question. And here's the answer. Because leadership in the kingdom of God is not first about position, it's about formation. It's not about saying who's the lead, who's the pastor, who's whatever else. No, it's about formation. A disciple learns obedience. A disciple learns humility. A disciple learns surrender, faithfulness, mission consistently. A disciple learns shared life. And those, you all, are the very traits that eventually sustain healthy leadership. You see, if someone is given responsibility without formation, then they may gain influence without maturity. But if someone is developed as a disciple, leadership can emerge from a healthier root. That's why the first question is not who has gifting. When you're looking for someone as far as leadership, the question is who's being formed. You can have a gift and not be formed and be immature. Because discipleship shapes character, reflexes, values, priorities. It shapes endurance. And leaders who have not learned to follow Jesus deeply may eventually lead people in ways that reproduce themselves more than Christ, unfortunately. Yeah. See, the strongest leaders are not those who skip discipleship. They are those who are shaped by discipleship. Those are the strongest leaders. You don't want someone, and talking about, again, from disciples to leaders to movement. If someone's not willing to be a disciple, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't care how charismatic they are. It doesn't matter how glib they may be in terms of appearance. If they're not willing to be a disciple, be discipled, they're not going to be the kind of leader that's needed for movement to happen and be sustained. Leadership that reproduces must come through disciple making. You see, once discipleship starts reproducing, leadership begins to emerge naturally. Why is that? Because some disciples are able to gather others. Yeah, they can strengthen. They can initiate mission. Some disciples know how to care for people. Some disciples can steward truth, create pathways. Some can even hold vision. But I'm going to tell you right now, that discipleship is actually healthiest when it rises from disciple making, not just by appointment, because you appoint someone. You see, every person has a pathway they must follow to be more like Jesus. And leaders must help develop those paths in the lives of the people they are discipling. Leadership that reproduces then does not merely create followers of a leader. No, it creates disciple makers. That means, you all, that healthy leaders are not trying to remain central forever. They don't want to be the focus. It's not just about them and years. I'm talking many years later. They're still the one everyone's pointing to and saying, there's the leader. No. What it does, you all, is they realize that they're helping other people hear Jesus, obey Jesus, and walk with others. They actually are again, creating disciples and moving out of the way. This is one of the reasons the 7 markers of organic discipleship we talked about in previous episode matter so much. Because they give a pathway for maturity, and that maturity becomes the soil from which leaders are able to emerge. Actually, leadership becomes movemental when it helps other people become faithful, reproducible disciples. Churches emerge, you all, from reproducing disciples and leaders. And now the chain we're talking about moves outward, again, from disciples to leaders to movements. Watch this. If reproducing disciples are forming and faithful leaders are emerging, then the church of Jesus Christ can begin to appear in more organic and reproducible ways wherever these leaders who are disciples may be. Why? Because the church is not first a building. In fact, that's impossible theologically. You've never seen the church be a building. But the church is also not a program, and the church is not an event. The church actually is the presence of Jesus in the people of Jesus everywhere all the time. Why is that important? Well, it's important, one, because that's the definition of the church, but then also when disciples obey Jesus, when leaders help form and release others, when shared life develops, when mission is sustained, when worship and word become embodied, not something you do or go, it's who you are and how you live. When spiritual family emerges, then church begins to take shape. Yes. His presence is seen in his people wherever his people may be. This is why reproducing churches are not merely organized gatherings. It's not just about how to start a second service. And I'm not being critical, but that is more than that. They are actually communities of disciples living under the lordship of Jesus together. Now that can be contextually relevant. That can be scaled, because no matter where you are, you're able to do that. And if churches are formed without the prior reproduction of disciples and leaders, you know what can happen? They can gather, but they may not multiply. In fact, the church is healthiest when it emerges from disciple making rather than trying to substitute for disciple making, trying to find different things to do as opposed to making disciples. Now the full chain comes into view. You have disciples. Well, as you have disciples, you're able to have leaders. As you have leaders, you're able to have churches. And if you have churches, you're able to have movements. See, movements are not built by hype. Movements are not sustained by novelty. It's not because of who we bring in and how good someone can speak and how well anyone can sing. That's not how movements are built nor sustained. Movements are not created by talking about multiplication while still organized around dependence, because that happens also sometimes. Well, we have multiplication talk, but yet people become the center. Individuals become the center. And now you're dependent on people, or dependent on a place, or dependent on a form, dependent on certain way things may be done. No, movements aren't created like that. In fact, movements grow when each part of the chain keeps reproducing. As disciples continue to produce leaders, and leaders continue to reproduce churches, as churches continue to reproduce movements, and that continues over and over again, that's how movements grow. If disciples can keep reproducing, leaders can continue to emerge. If leaders continue to reproduce, churches can continue to form and multiply. If churches continue to reproduce, movements can spread. And that, you all, is why disciple making is never small work. It's never just you leave it to somebody else, or this is just a little thing we're doing. No, it's major. It's important. It's significant. It may look hidden. It may look relational. It may even look slow, because it is a slow walk. It's not something that may get a lot of fanfare. But you know what happens in deep discipleship, you all? Deep discipleship can eventually shape cities. It can shape neighborhoods. It can shape households. It can shape networks. It has the power of transformation. That's why this season we've really been focusing on discipleship, because the beginning determines the kind of growth that's possible later. If we really can commit to, and I'm encouraging you as you engage, and I'm so glad you're engaged. I'm encouraging you as you engage to commit to discipleship. Commit to discipling others, not to be disciples of you, imitators of you, but imitators of Christ and how Christ did what he did. See, movements are not built by skipping steps. They're built when each layer reproduces from a healthy root. Then you can have movement. And again, it's a slow walk, but once it takes off, oh my gosh, it takes off. Yes, it may not happen as fast as you want, but once it takes off, look out below, because it is going to take off. But we still have to stay committed to the process. So here is the tension I want to leave you with for this episode. Lean in, because here's the tension. Ask yourself this: am I trying to build outcomes in my life or ministry that my disciple making is not yet strong enough to sustain? Wow, that's a heavy question right there. That's a heavy question. I'm going to ask the question again. Am I trying to build outcomes in my life or ministry that my disciple making is not yet strong enough to sustain? Am I expecting some outcomes, but I'm not putting the work of disciple making in? Or a better way of saying it, where have I wanted leadership, structure, and impact without first giving myself fully to the slow work of disciple making? You can't rush disciple making. And someone is not discipled until they make disciples who are able to make disciples. You can't rush that. You can't. And here's the I will statement. This week, I will identify one way I can invest more intentionally in discipleship as the foundation for what I hope God will reproduce later. Again, this week, I will identify one way I can invest more intentionally in discipleship as the foundation for what I hope God will reproduce later. Name that relationship you're going to invest. Name the investment you're going to make, and name the next step that you're going to take with whomever it is you are discipling as you invest in them, in that relationship. I want you to remember this, you all. Disciples make disciples. And when disciples reproduce, leaders begin to emerge. When leaders reproduce, churches can form. And when churches reproduce, movements can grow. So please do not despise the deep work of discipleship. Please don't rush past formation. Don't skip the root to chase the fruit. Please. Because what begins with disciples can eventually bless whole networks of people. There are whole networks of people waiting, hoping, and anticipating people like you who are engaged in this episode to make disciples, reproduce them, let leaders emerge, show them as they make disciples and they reproduce, churches form, and help them as they reproduce for movements to grow. And that's how movements grow, you all. Thank you so much for engaging. I really appreciate it. Listen, don't leave just yet. I have something I want to share as we close. I really, really appreciate you. And please know that until next time, let's take off. Everything we've talked about on Takeoff is meant to be lived, not just listened to. If you'd like to partner with this work, you can support the podcast for as little as $3 a month. Supporters help keep this work going and receive bonus episodes that offer deeper reflection and practical encouragement. This is a shared mission, not a transaction. And I'm grateful for every person who walks this journey